Disclaimer. The information and education material contained herein is meant to promote the general understanding and dialogue of GAN's processing. Such information is not meant or intended to serve as a substitute for a healthcare professional's clinical training, experience, or judgment. For patients and individuals, such information is not to be a substitute for professional medical, therapeutic, or healthcare advice or counseling. For medical issues or concerns, including decisions about medications and other treatments, readers, viewers, listeners should always consult their physician or, in serious cases, seek immediate assistance from emergency personnel. Prescription information, procedures, and use of medical devices information should be undertaken only by properly trained and certified medical personnel. We specifically disclaim any warranties, express or implied, including implied warranties of merchantability or fitness for a particular purpose. Such information is provided, as is, and is believed to be accurate at the time of its publishing, but it is the viewer's job to evaluate the accuracy of any information found in this presentation. Every case presented is of their own experience, applied by themselves for themselves, and it applies to their case only. Every person experiencing health problems should seek professional medical advice and consult their course of treatment with a doctor. The processes of plasma balancing described herein are a natural process which supports the body but does not replace medical advice or therapies one is already subject to.
And if you would, help me welcoming Alex, as he's given so much and he continues to give, and he's not looking for anything in return, but he's serving unconditionally and sharing the knowledge of the foundation and of the universe with all of us. So we're very fortunate again, Alex, to have you with us and to share your understanding of this technology. And you've experienced quite a bit of it, as we know. And hopefully we're creating more and more teachers. And if things go right, I'll probably won't have the backgrounds next week. I may be out of town, but I will be joining you. And I don't think I have to say anything more about that. But it'll be up to you, I think, to run the program if you choose, or however you choose to do it. So, but we're there on the soul level, or we will be here in the afternoon with you, depending on how things go.
And welcome, everybody.
Surprise.
Yes, thanks very much for that. Yes, yeah. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the North American classes here. And as always, I want to thank all the foreigners who come in here and beef up this session, because without you, we wouldn't be having as great a session as we have. So this is a worldwide affair. And it has a lot of significance, I found out. The reason for it is because we have a big job to do. And we've already done a big job. And we have thousands of hours of teaching. And many of us don't have thousands of hours to devote to learn and relearn. And we do need to have more teachers to speed up the process. So that's the purpose of these classes, and I hope you enjoy it, because we are on a mission. We're talking about the teachings of KAKT, which has been going on publicly for over a decade. And we have started to reap the rewards of all of those efforts, because our goal is not just for us personally, but it's for the whole planet. And it seems kind of brash to say that, but we have to understand that we are citizens of this planet, and so we have a responsibility. So I hope you enjoy this session as we get into it, and see if we can streamline it, and see if we can catch up with Mr. Kesh. This is the Kesh Foundation Spaceship Institute teachings on plasma science. We are in the review process now, and we will start with basic knowing. My name is Alexander. This is August the 20th of 2023. And yes, I am from Canada, but this is part of the North American Plasma Education Series. And as you see, we have been summarizing quite a few classes, and hopefully you're noticing a pattern between the basic, intermediate, and advanced classes. And so we have covered teaching, we have covered understanding. And so not only are we trying to condense the 6,000 hours, but you see, we started way back in 2020. We've almost started 4 years ago. And so we're trying to review the process so that a lot of people can catch up. And so we've caught up a year, and now we're only a couple of years behind. And we're going to talk about the basic knowing. And as you see, the subjects: physics, chemistry, botany, biology, microbiology, and religiosity. And they all have this commonality. And so let's start with physics, and let's see what that means to us, and understand that there's a reason to know this, because we all have this basic teaching, and we somehow have to bridge to advanced science. And can we do this gracefully, or do we just have to fall off the edge of the flat earth? So we introduced a basic understanding, and now we're embarking on basic knowing. And we need to cross this bridge, because that's how you move forward. That's why they call it advanced and not retarded. So we are now in the age of advanced science. We're in a post-June 6, 2022 era where we can make choices. And as such, it puts us in a different category as pioneers, but not the kind of pioneers that we read in our history books. We're the new space age pioneers. And we have to differentiate between what is outer space and what is Earth space. And in order to understand that, we have to understand our inner space. So all this is a process. And some of us can do it way faster than others. And then some of us, we just have these mental blocks, and maybe one day they dissolve like sugar in a hot cup of tea and melt away, and those roadblocks are gone. And so this is one of the reasons, as of December the 16th, we started interacting monthly with the soul and understanding the soul. And in this month of August, we are discussing the fields of the souls and the physicality. Well, is that one and the same? It sounds like one and the same. There is a common denominator, but there's a significant difference, and we have to understand that difference. And so this is the challenge as we get into these flight sessions to elevate the soul. And what are we seeking exactly? So we have to assess the meaning, and it's our life. So these are personal sessions, not group sessions. This is a unique feature. We've been doing group sessions since December. And through this understanding, we'll be able to bring our soul and our physicality back into balance. And that's our job. That's our job, to bring our soul and our physicality into balance so that we can help others do the same thing. And the KAKT Foundation is using this technology to bring it back into balance. And it shows us our existence and how we are behaving within, and how we are interacting emotionally in our life. And that's another very, very important factor. And we need to take that into account. So how does this affect the rest of the planet? And why is that significant? Because as we all seek the greater oneness, we have to understand that we are, as I say, citizens of this planet. And so every Tuesday we've tried the 287 sessions in a row, hosted by Rick Crammond, to bring together the one nation, one planet, one race. But it's for world peace. For world peace, because that is essential. Because there's another thing that's missing, and that's the universe. Well, the universe is not missing. We're the ones who are missing from the universe. You see, because what we're talking about here is how to build a home of superconducting souls. And we can't do that if the souls and the physicality aren't interacting. So we talk about warmongers and hate mongers, and I wanted to understand what the word monger means, because it has it's a funny word and has a funny definition. So a monger is a seller, and that's kind of ironic, because I personally have made a career of being a seller. And you know, so there are compliments and there are derogatory terms. And so when people say that they're a salesman, the first thing that comes to mind is a car salesman. And that's really unfortunate, because we need car salesmen. But it isn't the car salesman who is selling the car that's the problem. It's the attitude. And so a lot of people understand that when they're dealing with a car seller, that they will pay a premium for their lack of education. And so a monger is a seller, and is especially of something specific. And so there's always an adjective to go with monger, like fishmonger or ironmonger. And you could use it as a standalone noun, or you could use it as a suffix, such as words like a cheesemonger. I didn't even know there was a cheesemonger, so I've learned something. I've learned two things today. But in the slang, a monger means something else, and that is a person who attempts to stir up or spread something, whatever that is, but it's usually petty or discreditable, and it's usually used in combination. Well, warmongers aren't petty, but they sure are discreditable. But there are knowledge mongers. And so what's the difference between a knowledge seeker and a knowledge monger? And so another new word, add this to your vocabulary, ludus. What do you call a lover who sees love as a game only? You call them the ludus. And these are people with a ludic style that view love as a game. And of course, when you play a game, you always play to win, don't you? So there could be multiple players in the game. And the ludic individuals in that game are comfortable with deception and manipulation in the relationship. Isn't that what you want in a love affair? So we can see that someone who is a ludus is not a soul superconductor. And that's the difference between, I guess, marriage and divorce. But there's always this tugging, isn't it? There's a tugging between the brain or the heart. And so one of the ways to contain that is to chain it. But, you know, remember that famous song, Unchain My Heart? Well, we have a new song, Unchain My Brain. We have to identify what is the difference between this physicality and this plasma reality, and we call it matter plasma. Well, that's not very confusing, because we have a small m matter state, which is physical, and a capital M matter state, which is plasmatic. And there's this fundamental difference. So the physical you can touch and see, But the plasmatic, you can't touch and see. Aha, but you can sense it. So there is some kind of connection there. And we call that a reality manifestation because fundamentally, the formation of any field is a manifestation. So how do you form this field? Well, you have to have two fields to come together to form another. This is a very important point. We call that plasma feeding. So it's this activity that leads to manifestation. But here's the catch. It can either be non-tangible or tangible, non-visible or visible. So in other words, there is a plasmatic reality and a physical reality. So both are a manifestation. So either manifestation is a form artifact. Well, if that is the case, that means the emotional presence is also a form artifact. But a form artifact of what? And so now we get to the root of the matter, the energy in motion. And so when we look at the book number 1 and we see what is the universal order of creation of matter, and it has to do with energy in motion and the capture of energy in motion. And so we create a field. And in that field, we allow that energy to run around. And where do we capture it from? Well, that's a good question, because if we capture it from somewhere, it has to come to us somehow. And so that's I discussed in book number 2, the structure of the light. That's how we get from here to there. And what is it that we get from here to there? Well, it's this energy, and that's in motion. And then once we get it from there, well, then we have book number 3, the origin of the universe. Well, how can we have the origin of the universe after the structure of light and the universal order of creation? Because from the origin of the universe, 1 creates 2. Isn't that interesting? So this is very important to understand, because as we go down the plasma highway, we really have to know if we're coming or going. And this becomes very important because as we're searching for outer space, we have to find our little pie in that sky. And that really is our embodiment. And we have to understand that there's no speed limit on this highway. So we better be very good navigators. So fundamentally, in order to go one way, and that is to repel, when you have 2 the same, and there's this friction in between, so we find that these fields repel. Well, how do we get them to attract? So we flip the pole, and we make it attract. Opposites attract. So we have these 2 fields, and they are rotating, and they're creating this plasma reality, but they're rotating in opposite directions, and yet they're attracted. So this becomes an important point to understand, that the energy is converging at a certain point. But what happens when it gets to that point? Well, then from that point, it has to diverge. And so that creates a gap. So by going from the point of convergence to the point of divergence, we've crossed that point, haven't we? And so this becomes one of our dilemmas, because they say life is an illusion. Well, what exactly is an illusion? Well, it's something with a deceptive, oh, there's that word again. Something with a deceptive appearance. Something that deceives the senses or the mind. For example, by appearing to exist when it does not, or appearing to be one thing when it is in fact another. Well, how do you like them apples? So the question when we are looking at our science is we have to determine, is it a reflection or is it an illusion? And so nature is showing us the answer all the time. We just have to respect that and see that and decipher that and be discerning and be discriminatory. And oh my God, we got a lot of work to do. But it should all become second nature. Why should that become second nature? Well, because we're part of first nature. So after the first nature comes the second nature. So that should be automatic. So when we're looking at these rotating hemispheres, we see that we are now adjoined as a partner within these fields. And so we see the arrival of our RNA and our DNA, which comes in combination. But now we have another field. And that other field manifests itself into a physical reality. So here we are, we have a combination of the plasmatic reality and the physical reality. This energy is always in motion, so how do we contain it? So we have to give it this track so that it can keep going. And within this track, we have this field. And so there are many tracks, and it can go all over the place. And the thing is, the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere are still rotating, and they're rotating in the opposite directions. And doesn't matter if we're in the northern hemisphere or if we're in the southern hemisphere, our feet are firmly planted on the ground. And so the question is, are we in the northern hemisphere right side up, and those in the southern hemisphere are upside down? And funny you should ask that question, because people in the southern hemisphere ask the same question. Are they right side up and we're upside down? Well, some of us don't like to ask that question because we don't want to have the answer. But when we look at the way the universe is created, and going back to book number 3 with the origin of the universe, we see that we create these rays. And from these rays, we created what we call man's universe, and we create a sister universe. Well, I don't recall talking about any sister universe. And we do talk about the origin. And we do talk about how energy is moving back and forth. And that's a key point, isn't it? The energy is moving back and forth. Because if it comes from somewhere, how does it know where to go? So there has to be some kind of communication. So the fundal ray creation, as per the Keshe model of the nuclear decay of the neutron, it breaks up into 2 components consisting of 3 components. And one is the release of the PM ticks, and that's one component. And we call that part of the decay process, the residue, if you will. And then we look at the electron-proton combination, which we call the atom. So there's 2 components into one, but they always work together. And so that becomes like a marriage. And if that's the marriage, then, you know, maybe the release of the PM ticks is the divorce. Is that possible? It all depends on your point of view. And so this is what becomes so difficult when people ask you, well, what is plasma? So you need to define what is plasma. So in plain words, it's a kind of energy state. And so what we've been trying to understand is that there are different kinds of energy states. And all of these different kinds of energy states are available within our Earth. So it becomes very important to understand our Earth space. But within that Earth space, we all have a point of view. And that point of view reflects our inner space. And so once we find our inner space, then we can carry on with searching for outer space. This is the meaning of life and the purpose of life. And that's important. We don't understand that if important is not important, then nothing is important, is it? And this is why so many of us are practicing what we call energy binding. Now, energy binding is important because it's self-serving. And that's another thing that's important, is to be self-serving. But we're doing it at the expense of others. And as a result of that, what we find is that our soul vision becomes a disconnection between the transformation of the soul of man and the transportation of the soul and body. And so our focal point gets divided and disconnected, and our vision gets blurred. And we think it's okay, and we only look one way, but that's a binding, exclusive binding. So the binding is important, but energy flowing is also important because that's also part of self-serving. So the flowing of energy is a self-serving fulfillment at the enhancement of others. This is an important concept to understand. So when we talk about physics and we talk about energy in motion, that means the energy is always positive. But the direction is either negative or positive. That's what the charge is. And so based on the surface to volume ratio, we find that the higher the ratio, the higher the negative charge. And so the negative is the giver and the positive is the taker. But the negative has to give to the positive. So if the negative is giving to the positive becomes the taker. Well, where does the negative come from? So therefore the positive has to give to the negative. So therefore energy can be flowing or binding. And this is a big hurdle for physics, because this is the principal interaction. Energy is always in motion, and energy is always a two-way street. And so when we want to understand physics and we want to understand the atom, we understand it in its binding position, where we have the energy flowing from the north to the south pole and around the equator. But what we have to understand is that there's a flowing between other fields. And so those fields have to be maintained as they do in the binding scenario, but the energy has to be shared between the fields of the two binding scenarios. So this is done simultaneously and concurrently. It's a two-way street. And so when we talk about attraction and repulsion, there has to be a difference, and that difference is plus magnetical. That's part of natural creation. But when there's magnetical, there has to be gravitational. So what is the gravitational? Well, it's the repulsion attraction force plus a gravitational. And so when we're looking at the natural decay, and we say, okay, well, that's the gravitational, and the natural creation is the magnetical. And so the magnetical has to be emitted from a maggrav position. And that emission needs to be absorbed from a maggrav position. So the emission is a maggrav plus the magnetical, and the absorption is a maggrav plus the gravitational. It's a two-way street. So when we're looking at this situation where we're knowing by connection, and that's what we're talking about by knowing, here we have both. We have two p-ticks coming together and creating a field. We corral them in the field because they got to keep moving, and they create one. They create one maggrav condition, which involves an X, Y, and Z axis, 3 different dimensions. And so the magnetical flows, comes together and creates this gravitational field. And then there's this other field, which we don't see anything in the middle of it, and that's a transition field, isn't it? So we have two coming into one. But the problem, of course, you see, is that the two are two cases of one. So the two ones come together to create one. And so in physics, we see where 1 and 1 creates 1. A lot of people have a problem with that, so we create a map where 1 and 1 creates 2. But as we've been saying in the plasma science, 1 and 1 is more than 2. Because we have a magnetical residue. So when we look at plasma science and we want to talk about it, we have to talk about the forces of attraction and repulsion. And so what they really are is gravitational and magnetical field forces. And so we see as the energy is coming together, that's the gravitational convergence of energy. And so as the magnetical forces are going away, that's a divergence of energy. And so these are the common rules, and yet we're all unique. And so we find that we are all independent. We're all variable. And so by being a variable and by being unique, you automatically become independent. Because you cannot be unique and be dependent, because then you have to be dependent on something else, and you're no longer unique. But this is the conundrum. We want to be independent, but there's an interdependence in the universe. And where does this interdependence come from? It comes from the force field interactions of attraction and repulsion. But that does not limit your independence. What that does is determines your position. And so there are rules, there are plasma rules. So we have different energy states, we've already said that, but they increase or decrease by at least an order of magnitude. So that's a factor of 10. We'd all like to have our paychecks increased by an order of 10. So that when you have more, you can give more. And this is where the higher energy states feed the lower energy states. But what we have is natural creation or natural decay. And they're exactly the same thing because they're changing energy state. And just the way they manifest. But then there's other energy states which remain the same. They don't change energy states. So therefore they're not consuming. But how do they interact? So they have to interact as a catalyst. And so as a catalyst, it has two functions. One, it can initiate a reaction, or it can continue a reaction. And depending on which transfer state it is, and this becomes very important to understand that there's a transfer rate. And this transfer rate is higher by many orders of magnitude in higher energy states. The lowest energy state being the small m matter state. And as we approach the highest levels, if you will, a new factor comes into play more dynamically, and that is the ethos of the universe. Because the plasma energy is bound to the ethos of the universe. So in the lower energy states, it kind of becomes non-visible to us. And we treat it non-tangibly. And we've done that not only at the expense of others, but at their own expense. Because that's not how the universe was created. The universe is created and exists from energy, and energy is always in motion. And so when we see on the cover of book number 1, the universal order of creation of matter, so all the energies come together as matter, dark matter, and antimatter. It comes together in one field. So that means it comes together from another field. But does it have to be at the same energy state? No. We can transcend different energy states. And if we can transcend different energy states, then we can transcend different dimensions. And if we can transcend different dimensions, then we can change position. And that's how the energy comes from the sun to the earth. You see, it changes position. And we say there's a vacuum, and there's nothing in the vacuum of space. Well, clearly, it's full of energy. And so we said that energy is always positive, and that energy has a charge. So this charge is coming from the sun, and it's passing through this vacuum of space. We didn't say what kind of space, but what we're saying is that we're getting the energy coming from the sun to the earth. But is that the only place we get the energy from? That's the one that catches our attention, isn't it? But wherever we are, we're positioned somewhere in space. And what is the definition of space? So we could say that the definition of space is all that you can see. And all that you can see is the physical reality. But what you can't see is the plasma reality. So when you say all, you have to include all. And energy is the plasma field transaction currency that allows you access to both types of reality. And this energy is a plasma field. And there are no plasma gas stations to fill up. So this is why susceptibility becomes important. When you say, well, nothing is nothing. Nothing is nothing. It can't be nothing. It has to be something. But what something is that? So something is always something as opposed to being something else. So on the left side, we're looking down into this cup. We see the Gans in the bottom of the cup, and the cup is full of water. We're starting to see a kind of a rotating field develop. And then when we look at the graph on the right-hand side, we see, well, we see nothing. There's a hole in the Gans. So that rotating field has manifested a hole. I don't see that piece. I just see the residue. I just see the hole. And I have to see that hole through the glass, as if the glass is not even there. But the glass isn't invisible, it's transparent. I see the glass, but I can see through the glass. How is that possible? And then there's the water, and I can see through the water as well. But I can't see through the Gans until it has a hole. And so these all things sound like very simplistic notions, but they're key. They're key to understanding. Because if you don't understand it, you're liable to break the glass and spill the water and ruin the pattern. And see, plasma interaction is all about patterns. We create this infinity loop and we talk about it. And so what does that mean? That means all things are in combination. And in order to maintain this connection, there's this magnetical pushing and this gravitational pulling. And the combination creates a Magravs condition. And when you have a magma condition, which is really an artificial condition because it means it's in balance. And there is no magma condition in balance. There is a balance of forces. There's a balance of positioning. There's a plasmatic reality, there's a physical reality. But if it was truly in balance, it would be non-existent. Because energy is always in motion. It doesn't stop. It always keeps going. And so if it keeps going, it has to know where it's going. And that's what we understand when we make the cups of life. Because we had physics. We created physical things. And from that, using our emotional strength, we brought together the GANs. And how we did it, we created a zinc plate and nano-coated copper coil in the copper coil. And we created a magnetical field and a gravitational field. We also connected things, but we're not showing the connections as wires. We're showing the interaction of the fields because that's what's important. You have to understand the magnetical and gravitational field and its positioning. And then when we create one cup and then we create another cup, and by changing components, we made one cup emotional and one cup physical. And so we find that the physical is weaker. The physical is weaker than the emotional. So by definition, the weaker field is magnetical. So the emotional as a stronger field is gravitational. And so it becomes a gravitational taker, and the physical becomes the magnetical giver. And when you keep giving and you keep taking from the lowest energy source, you begin to get depleted. And there are many ways to deplete, but in all ways we call that aging. And so here we are looking at taking all the components out of the cup. Then we say, well, it's finished, it's gone. And then what do we see? This crystalline formation that comes that you as an artist would not be able to recreate with a brush or with your hand or even with a swizzle stick. Because when you remove the components, you leave the plasmatic field behind. And it's non-visible and non-tangible until it manifests into a different kind of reality. And so in this case, it's manifest into a salt-like residue all around the cup. And now you can see the rotating field. And so that plasma reality, which is non-visible and non-tangible, has manifested a tangible physical reality that you can see as a rotating field and a distinctive pattern. It's undeniable for those who care to look. But as long as the water is still in there, we have a kind of a fluid reaction. And so on the left-hand side, we can clearly see the GANs, how it's piled up against the outer perimeter of the bottle. And when we look down from the top, you can clearly see the GANs is making a ring at the bottom, and there's a hole in the GANs. And you can see the glass right through the table underneath. And as I said, you can't do that with your finger or with a swizzle stick. There is some kind of energy that is doing that. You can't dispute it because the evidence is there. There's a central field in the core, and there's a spiraling energy force that is coming out. Well, there's a spiraling energy force coming in as well. Why? Because it's a magnetical gravitational force field. There are two force fields working together. One is pushing, one is pulling. And so now we understand when we talk about principal matter, these are the PM ticks. These are the energy that's always in motion. These are the energy that are going through the vacuum as a parcel. They're an energy parceling unit. And there's one parcel coming, and there's other parcels coming, and they come from all over. And each one is a force, and they come together in the field and have an interaction. And so this becomes a combination of antimatter, dark matter, and matter. And when they come together like that, they create another field, and we call that a maggrav. And so when we look at the component of maggrav, and we see that one is magnetical and one is gravitational. Well, the magnetical one, we call that the electron, and the gravitational one, we call that the neutron. Where's the proton? So we have to see that when we have magnets in the physicality, we understand that there's a repulsion force. And we also see when we bring two magnets together, excuse me, we have an attraction force. But in the plasma reality, when we remove the magnets, the force field remains, and the repulsion and attraction forces also remain. So the difference is in the physical field, when you remove the physics, you remove the field forces. In the plasma world, when you remove the force fields that cause the interactions, the interaction remains. Key point. And so when we talk about physics, we have to have a relationship with something. And so we're on the planet Earth. And we see the planet Earth as something that has to do with physics. And that's part of our environment. So our interaction within our Earth is our environment. And so that becomes the third and fourth cup. And all of these cups work together. And each of these cups have a magnetical gravitational relationship. And the third cup is the cup of soul. And so that cup also has a magnetical gravitational relationship. But each soul is right at the core. And so when we bring all the five cups together, they act as one. Collectively, they make a magnetical gravitational maggrav condition with the soul. And so this is the basis of the plasma feeding principle. We take all the things into account: the soul, the emotion, the physicality, our Earth, and the byproduct of our interaction with the Earth, which is the environment, which we call inertia. But there's a feeding that goes back and forth. There's a natural creation and a natural decay. And in either case, it's a creation, but there's also catalytic stability. And so from that catalytic stability, energy can flow as it does from the sun, but to understand that the energy flows back. And so all of these are different energy states, and there's a flow back and forth between each energy state. And so understand that the flow between each energy state is different, has a different rate by an order of magnitude, at least one. And this is part of the plasma feeding process. So this is just beyond physics. It's now into the plasma reality, not the physical reality. And so when we talk about physics, we have to understand our point of view. So yes, we have a relationship with our earth, but we have to understand that we have a relationship with our soul. And so when we're looking from our point of view, then our soul is gravitational. When we're looking from the earth's point of view, then the earth is gravitational. And you understand that because we're attracted to the earth and opposites attract. So that attraction force is what we're giving back to the earth. So we give out the magnetical force to interact with the gravitational force of the earth. And it doesn't matter if we're in the northern hemisphere or the southern hemisphere, we have our feet firmly planted on terra firma. And so we come to what we call materialism. And what is the difference of materialism from regular manifestation? And so we see the classic difference is the materialism is physicality. Materialism is a manifestation, but specific to physicality. And when we're talking about specific physicality, we're talking about nuclear decay. And why nuclear decay? Because the nuclear decay is already decayed from the plasma. So the nuclear decay is the intermediate step to the physicality. In other words, it's a gravitational transition of reality. The physicality being the gravitational lowest energy state. And the nuclear decay is the intermediary. And so we've focused on this gravitational reality, which we call materialism. And so instead of pursuing science, we pursue money. And the money then becomes our reality manifestation proxy. We substitute the money for science. And in that pursuit of money, we've actually created limitations for ourselves. So it becomes a pursuit of limitations. And so when we look at the 5-cup system, what do we see? We see zinc plates and zinc coils and copper coils and iron coils, and it's all physics, right? Well, what happens in the cup of the universe? We've changed the configuration, we've changed the pattern. And from this, we all get to this independent variable. Something's missing, isn't it? Something in the center. Because when we take care of the physical inventory, we see the basic elements that we bring in. We brought in iron, copper, carbon, zinc, and we manifested copper oxide and zinc oxide called GANs. And we did this with, well, some things are in coils, some things are in plates. And then the wires and the coils and the plates, some of them are nano-coated, some of them are bare. And so we have this physical inventory. Now we know all the components. And that's all we know. And that's the problem with the periodic table of elements, you see, because they're all elementary, my dear Watson. Elements are elementary. Life is much more complex. The sum of the parts is greater than the sum of the parts. That's the difference between knowing the details and the details of knowing. That's what we're talking about. We're talking about knowing. So here are all your periodic table of elements, and we find that iron is the central component. And we're concerned with our emotional physicality and our physical physicality, because these are all part of our immediate reality. And then we look at our environment and we see that other things that we need to facilitate our physicality is magnesium and calcium. And so to make this a little bit better, we moved the two columns from the left and moved them over to the right. And then we shrink it down a little bit so that we can see what are the things that are really, really important. So we find that hydrogen is kind of schizophrenic. We really don't know where to put it, but we find it's a very important component of amino acid, which includes the hydrogen with carbon, nitrogen, and oxygen. So that's one team. And then, of course, we look at the chlorine and the sodium that comes together to create salt. Well, that's a medium. And then we have magnesium and calcium, which are fundamental for, shall we say, bone building. And then, of course, we talked about the zinc with the emotional construct and the copper with the physical construct. We just didn't include iron yet into this particular chart. So let's discuss chemistry. Because when we talk about chemistry and we talk about states, first thing comes to mind is the difference between gases, liquids, and solids. These are different energy states, but there are causes that change these states. And so we know that one of them is fire. Another is what we call a potentiation of hydrogen. That's pH for short. Another thing is oxidation, and another thing is emulsification. So we find that oxidation is magnetical, and reduction is the opposite of oxidation, is gravitational. Well, here's another confusing set of terms, isn't it? If the gravitational is the taker, which means that it's increasing, how can it be reducing? It's okay. As long as you understand the relationship of the magnetical gravitational reaction. So the reduction is actually going towards the alkaline side. And alkalinity is the opposite of acidic. So in order to be acidic, that means the pH or potentiation of hydrogen goes down. In order to be alkaline, the pH goes up. And the way we know how to make alkaline water is either through electrolysis or chemical altering. With the plasma science, we can achieve alkalinity with plasma altering. And you can only do that if you're true to the soul. Because we find that our society is very acidic. The condition of a society being in this extremely acidic condition is unnatural. So we pride ourselves on our chemical formulas, and let's just have a quick look at that. We have a notation, so there's a way to describe things, and we put them in equations where the left side equals the right side. So there would be a balance. You know what we mean by a balance. That means it doesn't exist. But this balance is just like in physics, except now you're taking these elements and combining them. So in physics, we would say that these are molecules, but in chemistry, these would be solutions. So you can have solutions of liquids, or maybe we can have solutions of problems. So let's look at a solution of gas. And so we find that when we take carbon dioxide, we combine two elements and as carbon and oxygen, and we produce carbon dioxide or CO2. And so to write the equation, because oxygen comes in pairs, then you would say carbon plus two hydrogens, two water molecules gives you CO2 plus four hydrogens. So there's your carbon dioxide, the CO2 being your carbon dioxide. So this would be a chemical equation. And then you look at the zinc oxide and the same thing. You take your zinc and two water molecules, you get your zinc plus water and two hydrogens. So notice that the oxygen comes in pairs, but this oxygen now is shared between the zinc oxide and the water. And so that's why you don't have as many hydrogens left over. And the same thing happens in carbon dioxide. The oxygen comes in pairs and splits up between and is shared by the copper and the water. And you still have two hydrogens left over. So that's chemistry as math. But chemistry as dance, we find that if we combine the copper, the zinc, and the water and the salt, we get CO2 gas. And don't forget the nano-coated copper. But if we substitute the copper for zinc, where we have the zinc and the nano-coated zinc, we get, oh, there's a mistake. We get zinc oxide. So that should be ZNO. And then if we get copper oxide and a nano-coated copper, we get CuO, copper oxide. So this is chemistry as a plasma science. So we have the coils, we have the plates, we have the nano-coating, we have the salt, and now we have the gas. So we've added the gas, and you know, we have all this excess hydrogen, right? So let's review this chemical inventory, because we've added salt water, right? Which is sodium and chloride. But, you know, where does that fit in the equation? So if we look at the bottom equation and see salt with sodium plus chloride plus four hydrogens plus two oxygens, what do we get? We get salt plus water. Okay. So that's your chemical inventory. So now let's remember we had this extra hydrogen left over, right? So it's gone now. When we do this chemical inventory and we take everything that we did before, but we add different kinds of salt, sodium plus chloride, potassium plus chloride, magnesium plus chloride, or calcium plus chloride. What we get the salt plus two water. So the hydrogen is gone and the oxygen is gone. And where did it go? Well, it went into the water. Let's look at botany, another science. And so we see that we took our elements of atomic copper, and we created monatomic copper, which we call nanocoating. And we basically unchained. And when we look at this caterpillar, doesn't it have a funny shape? It looks like it's made of fat, and it kind of looks like a moving monatomic structure, doesn't it? Just saying. And so when we look at how fatty acids are created, and fatty acids are created from amino acids, and we look at this phospholipid bilayer, which rings around each cell and creates this layer. And then we look at alpha linolenic acid, which is a very important fatty acid. It's an essential fatty acid, what we call omega-3, 6, and 9. But what that means is that's where it bends. And we talked about the bending and what happens. So with each bending, we find that the negative is on the outside, the positive is on the inside. And so we find that on the outside is hydrogen, on the inside is oxygen. And we bring these three oxygens together in the center. And so we have the hydrogen on the outside and the hydrogen plus oxygen on the inside. We have now created water. The water is inside the protein. And that's a good thing, because oil and water don't mix. And if oil and water did mix, then each of us would be a big bag of mush. It's because oil and water don't mix that you and I can walk upright. But if we have too much oil, we call that being fat. And sometimes we want to get rid of fat by, sucking the fat out. We call that liposuction. But, by making the water alkaline, which is to raise the pH, we can get to a point where we emulsify the fat. But that has to be an extremely high pH. And it is an extremely high pH, like we're talking over 11.5. We can emulsify the fat. In other words, oil and water will mix. And if we go even higher into the caustic chemistry, such as sodium hydroxide and potassium hydroxide, that becomes extremely high pH. And it actually is fundamental to nanocoating our copper foils. So what are the plants doing? And so they're actually chemical plants, aren't they? But when we say chemical plants, we refer to those as factories that can either create chemicals, and in the process of creating chemicals, they create pollution. And then, of course, in the process of creating pollution, they create global warming. And then, of course, it's a new industry of global cleanup. And so we find that we have the chemical plants in competition with the natural plants. So we could say that the chemical plants are part of the global warming, and the natural plants then are part of the global cleanup. Because that's part of the protein building. Remember those hydrogens and oxygens that disappeared into water? Well, we created amino acids. Where was the amino acid created in a cup of GANs? On the top, on the surface. So that means the additional oxygen and hydrogen, and in fact, nitrogen and carbon, came from the atmosphere. So the water came from within, and the amino acid came from without, and it became part of protein building. And the proteins come from the amino acids. So therefore, in order to create protein, we have to create water. Or if we create water, we have to create protein. that becomes pretty interesting, because when we look at the daisy, and we see it as a long stem, and it has this fancy flower. It has a hexagonal formation in the middle and petals on the outside. And we understand that there's a magnetical gravitational force field, and that there's a soul in the center. And so this soul is represented by this amino acid at the core. We have to see that. This is how the daisy is created. But what we have to see is the dynamic plasma reaction that has created this, not the form artifact. The form artifact of the chemical reaction that employed the physical elements to create the daisy. We have to look at the dynamic energy of energy and motion that came together and created these different fields. And if we look at this pattern, we can see the interaction of the higher field strengths and the weaker field strengths, and the pushing and the pulling, and how they create another pattern. And so that's the pattern from within. So we can change that pattern though. And so what that means is that when you create something, you create something else. Well, the way we look at it is when we create something, the opposite is garbage. And that's another unfortunate term. But what we have to understand is that there is no garbage. And the decay is another form of creation. So it just happens to be opposite in terminology to creation. And so this is fundamental to ray motion, because ray motion is creation. So we already know that the neutron model breaking down into the atom, which is an electron-proton marriage, releases PM ticks. So that's part of natural creation. So the PM ticks would be part of the natural creation. And the mass of the electron-proton marriage is less than the mass of the neutron. There's your natural decay. So that is part of the creation process. Well, when you have a creation process, then you have a decay process. And that decay process is the reflection, not the illusion, it's the reflection of the creation process in a lower energy state. But in order to have a reflection, it has to reflect from another field. One field has to reflect another field, and these two fields work together. And so one field manifests as a plasmatic reality, and another field manifests as a physical reality. The physical manifestation is what we call materialization. And so when we look at our RNA, DNA, and how it works together, we have to understand that there's an interaction point between the RNA and the DNA, but there are hemispheres that interact. And so there's also an interaction point between these two. And so we see the growth of the infinity loop, how it grows in the different dimensions. And then it becomes into the star formations. And so through these star formations, we have the convergence and divergence of energy that transforms at the conversion point. And that conversion point has to go in another dimension. And that becomes the inertia. One and one is more than two. So when you're looking at one cell and you're looking at the conversion of energy, you have to see that the energy is coming in, and so there has to be a relationship to have that. And that energy that comes in allows the cell to grow, and energy has to go out, and that allows the garbage to go out. but that garbage is actually energy in motion. And so what we're looking at is the conversion of energy within the cellular function. And so from that cellular function, we have this origin. And some people are into biggity bangities, and other people are into primordial swill, or evolution, or the survival of the fittest, or what they call a natural selection. Well, that is a natural selection, yes. And so things are chosen in the natural selection, aren't they? That's not what they mean, is it? Because they're looking at it from a physical standpoint. See, food enhances you, but we use food as a drug because we like our creature comforts. We're the creatures and we like to be comfortable. And then you have prophets like Timothy Leary who, took this food as an oral use and decided to just use things like LSD or other injection methods, which are called mainlining, and create creature comfort through mind altering. So we can do mind altering orally or by injection. And we can do injections by needles or by bullets, right? But there's another way to do it, and that's by feeding estrogen-enriched compounds. That'll do an alteration. And so we can do a physical and or chemical alteration. It amounts basically to the same thing. We're talking about the physical reality. So when we're looking at what we call windward or leeward, we have to understand that the windward is the direction upwind from the point of reference. That's the reference from which the wind is coming. And leeward as the downward, the point of reference where the wind is going, right? So we talk about coming and going. And so when you cross over the watershed, going from the windward side to the leeward side, we start to see that we have some missing ingredients. Because there's no accounting for the plasmatic reality, is there? Is it moral or is it chemical? Is it plasmatic or is it physical? And then we find that gas does some funny things that physics and chemistry cannot explain, such as gas as a nanosolid. And so when we're looking at physics and chemistry and botany, and these subjects are just out of range. That's what the problem is. So when we're looking at a range convergence, we have to have our point of view. And if our point of view is from the soul point of view, then when we understand that we are in a dynamic plasma state, and the heat and electricity is the lowest energy state. It's the small end matter state. And the heat and electricity are just a transfer state that allows us to transfer one state to the next. And the next state is the nuclear physics. And then after that is the plasma physics. The plasma physics neutralizes the nuclear physics, right? But we are still in the physical state. How do we transform into the plasma state? And that's where we are in this particular basic knowing. And so this botany becomes biology. We have to understand how this energy is being transferred. And so it's interesting when you look at the general dynamics of a rainforest and you see really, and if we clue into what's going on in Brazil, we see that the rainforest is basically living in a very fertile top layer of soil. Because that top layer of soil is very, very thin. And underneath that top layer is a sand substrate. And when we think of a sand substrate, we think of a desert. So to convert this sand to a soil, we need bacteria. And the question then becomes, well, how do we get the amino acid into the soil to create the rainforest? And it would be a logical question to ask, is there oil in the soil then? Or is it in the land of the sands? Well, isn't it interesting? You know, you look at Venezuela as a major oil producer, and you look at the Middle East as the same characteristic. So what's the connection? So the connection is that we see that the sands from Africa and the sands in the substrate in the rainforest are the same sands. And so somehow they cross over the Atlantic and land in the rainforest there. And so as the rainforest grows and decays and creates more soil, that soil rests on top of the sand. And that's what keeps the rainforest going. And the rainforest then is abundant and thriving because it needs water. And so we find that the water comes from the amalgamation of hydrogen and oxygen. We call it H2O, and it's in a MAGRAV condition. But how can two oxygens balance off? I mean, how can two hydrogens balance off to one oxygen? How do we create this water? And how do we create this biomass? And so we find one of the most prolific plants on this planet. We call it invasive. That's a phenomenal filter. It's a phenomenal water filter. And it's a phenomenal biomass builder. And what's very interesting, this plant, which we call a water hyacinth, floats on the water. And so what you see is these petals and bulbs which allow the plant to float. And there are long, hairy roots underneath in the water. And they're dark. And then for a day or two, we get a flower. A day or two in the whole year. And this plant is a chemical factory. It picks up heavy metals and becomes a home for algae, which is a primitive plant. And from that becomes protoplasm, then becomes bacteria, and then other species. So what happens is that one species becomes a precursor for the next, and some are beneficial. And so they'll either decay as a biomass or roadkill, right? It takes 9 days to eliminate roadkill. And that's how we go from simple to complex. And so where are we in all these dimensions? So, you know, we classify ourselves as vertical people, but we're also horizontal people. So we have a special classification of man where we can transition these different ranges. We can climb mountains and go into the seas, and we can go from one continent to the other. And we are basically little packs of energy in motion as well. And so we need to understand this classification better. And that's what biology is the classification. So in order to understand this classification, we have to go through dissection. Isn't that what we do? We want to find out how things work. Well, let's take it apart. Let's do what they call reverse engineer it, so we can see what exactly are we made from. We do that with the earth, don't we? You know, we mine it, and so, oh, there's the copper, oh, there's the oil, oh, there's the gold. But we don't wonder about the positioning of it, do we? Because we find that the copper, say, is in Chile, the oil is in the Middle East, and the gold is in the Far East. You know, how does that work? How does that happen? You don't find them all mixed together, do you? It's just like oil and water, they don't mix. Our organs don't mix either. Our organs are positioned as well. And interestingly enough, we see the organs come in pairs, just like oxygen. But, you know, we are an individual, and we have a circulation, and we have a central nervous system, and we have a reproductive system. But all of these systems are things in combination. So when we look at biology, we have to understand that there's a physiology where the brain and the body link up. We have respiration, which, you know, because our cells don't have lungs, but they do respire. We have to understand that. And they don't have any mouths either, but they do digest food. And speaking of digestion, how do we get rid of dead cells? Well, they lyse or self-digest. And in order to self-digest, we have lysosomes. These are actually spheres made up of lipid bilayers, which is what cells are made up of, except the lysosomes digest the cells. And then we have what we call garbage, which we have to cast out, and that's called metabolism. And so when we're looking at our health, we discuss what we take in as food and what we cast out. And so there's a giving and taking, isn't it? And there's a sequencing. So we start with the amino acids, we go through the DNA, we talked about that, essential fatty acids. From that, we create the proteins. Enough proteins together create the cells, and then we create organelles, and then we create organs. And all the combination of organs and everything else, we have bodies. Okay, well, this is good. And so now I hope all of you have this warm and fuzzy feeling, because you know, you are alive and sitting in the comfort, and you find that you have this plasma feeding that is coming to you, and there's no accounting for that. So let's get into microbiology to see if we can understand that a little bit better. And so this is what we do with all this land that we're talking about, you know, and this bacteria. And then we understand that there's actually two types of bacteria, what we call aerobic and anaerobic bacteria. And what that means is bacteria that is oxygen loving or oxygen repelling, anaerobic. And the man who invented plowing in 1797 apologized, I guess, on his deathbed, because he found that it poisoned the soil and fostered the growth of weeds. Why? Because he flipped the aerobic and anaerobic bacteria. And so the anaerobic bacteria was exposed to oxygen, and it died. And the aerobic bacteria was denied of oxygen, and it suffocated. And so now you've increased the biomass, haven't you? And you've retarded the growth cycle by 6 weeks. And also in the process, you've produced methane. And this is the gas that we see that comes out of municipal dumps, also out of cesspools, standing water, and of course those fabulous vineyard holding lagoons that you see in the pig farms and the cattle farms. And, you know, we see the burning of methane, however, produces CO2 and water. Well, CO2 is energy, and CO2 creates food for the plants. It's also a very efficient insulator. Like really efficient, way more efficient by orders of magnitude. And of course, then we get water. Well, isn't that good that Mother Nature is taking care of business? All because it understands the core component, which is the neutron, the combination of the Magravs condition created by the convergence of matter, dark matter, and antimatter into its gravitational core component. And from there, it creates the electron atom marriage in the decay process and the release of PMTX, which is energy in motion. And so we find that this is the fundamental infinity loop that's created from the divergence and convergence around the eddy core, and is the building of the dimensions that we need to facilitate the creation of oxygen, which is basically 8 hydrogens. But it has a much higher mass because hydrogen does not have a neutron, but oxygen does. And that's why it's structured this way. And all we have to do is add another 2 hydrogens to it, to the fundamental oxygen, which is very stable. And then we have a water. But see, the problem is that water always comes in pairs. So really, it isn't H2O, it's 2H2O. Has to be. Because when you shear the hydrogen off of the water molecule, the hydrogen is the positive energy, and what's left behind is the hydroxyl. So the hydroxyl is considered negative, and it's a giver, and it is a generous giver, which is why water is a universal solvent and is fundamental to life. And it's one of the ways that we clean up all the mess that we make. And so in that process, we create dirty water. And so that's the product, the dirty water. And since we're 75% water, you can understand how we get to be dirty on the inside. We call it toxicity. And so many of us are preoccupied with detoxification because we live in an environment that's become very toxic. And so fortunately for us, the stacker feeding continues. So when we want to look at our environment, we want to understand our personal environment, which we call a terrain inside. And so we look at a somatoscope, which is the opposite of a telescope. It's a microscope of a higher order of magnitude invented by Gaston Nasons. And in the top portion of the picture, you see that it has different lenses. And what it looks like is a blood sample. But this blood sample is not a dead blood sample. It's a living blood sample. And we can't see it. We can't see what's going on inside. And the reason we can't see it is because for most of us, the blood turns red. So we can't see what's inside. Why does the blood turn red? Because it oxidizes. It comes in contact with the air. So we have to see through that color, don't we? We have to see what the sustenance is of that blood. So when you look at the bottom half of this picture, you see the convergence of 2 light forces coming together to create an image. And this was perfected by Gaston Nasons, and that allowed him to see blood at a different level. We're talking about 30,000 times magnification here on the left side. What he did on the right side was 125,000 magnification. And what you get at the local health specialist, shall we call it, They have what they call dark field microscopes. You have to understand 8,000 magnification. So big difference, orders of magnitude. And what you see here, well, it's the blood cell. And you can see that it's hollow. It does have a ring, but it's hollow. And what you can see is that there's a gap between the blood cells and other cells. And there's nothing there except these spots. Well, these spots that you see are somatids. And in this picture, it's a still picture. But under the somatoscope, these things are moving. And how do they move? There's a pushing and pulling of the magnetical gravitational field forces of the somatids. And where did they come from? They came from inside the blood cell. And what is this other thing that is floating in there? Well, that's a residue. And so that either is a toxin or is something that is leaving. And so just the same way that we use our rivers to bring us nutrition or to take away our waste, the blood system is doing the same thing through the blood vessels. It brings the nutrition and takes away the garbage. And so the question becomes, is blood something that we need to spill? Or maybe we need to spill the oil. And we have to look at why we're having trouble understanding this. And how far back do we have to go? So we could see that if we go back 174 years now, right? There was a battle, a conflict between Antoine Béchamp and Louis Pasteur. And it revolved around the concepts of microorganisms. So the winner, of course, was Louis Pasteur, because we had this conventional medicine, what we call mainstream medicine or orthodox medicine or Western medicine. And that is different words meaning the same thing, allopathic medicine. So this is a method where medical professionals treat symptoms and diseases using drugs, radiation, or surgery. Antoine Béchamp in 1851 has demonstrated microzymas, and they have exactly the same characteristics as the somatids that Gastonasons has shown. So 1851 was kind of a watershed moment. So we've had to come up with other different ways to look at these climate zone changes. And we see that, we have deserts, so like the Sahara Desert, and we have the tropical, like the Brazilian tropical rainforest, the Amazon tropical rainforest. And then, of course, we have the temperate zones, and beyond the temperates, we have the Arctic and the Antarctic. But we also have fresh waters that are inland, and then we have seawater that is between the continents. And so all of these zones are constantly in action. They're next to each other. And so they maintain their position. And how they maintain their position is by exchanging energy. So it's the rate of change, which is a factor, isn't it? So, if you're comfy and you're nice and warm and in comes a gust of wind and it's a cold wind, well, you won't be so comfy. But, we are mammals, we live on land, and fish live in the water, except for this big fish, which is called a whale. And is a whale a fish? Well, it's not, it's a mammal, because its babies are born in the water. Which is kind of funny, isn't it? Because the whale baby is born in the water, whereas we're born in the air, and we come out of the water. And another thing that's funny is that when we come out of the womb, it's a very fast rate of change. And so we can go from, shall we say, water breathing. Well, fish would breathe with their gills, right? They would exchange oxygen with their gills. So if you take a fish out of water, it'll suffocate. So yet when we come out of the water, we can breathe almost immediately. So the rate of change is a factor. But there are fish that live in fresh water and fish that live in salt water. And so how do they metabolize? So you find that the freshwater fish are freshwater on the outside, salty on the inside. Seawater fish are salty on the outside and fresh on the inside. And so that gradient difference between freshwater and seawater is the gradient flow. And that gradient flow facilitates a change, and the rate of change becomes a factor in that as well. And so when we look at the animals and, we talk about the survival of the fittest, then, generally speaking, when you eat something, that thing that you eat is smaller than you, unless you're very skillful at taking something bigger apart and breaking into smaller bits. But interestingly enough, that the biggest mammal, the whale, eats the smallest particle. It eats the plankton in the water. But there's a smaller particle than that, and that's a virus. And so the whales are commonly infected with something called a calicivirus. And this topic is a very sensitive topic. But if you want to know about virology, there's a very good Columbia University in the city of New York, and they have a very good YouTube channel, which has all these classes, and it has more than what I'm showing here, but you go through these 12 classes and you will understand everything you need to know about viruses. And these people are absolutely expert at it. And I highly recommend that you go through it, because one of the things that you really want to know is in number 6, where the RNA directs RNA synthesis, and number 7, the transcription and RNA processing. And they tell you very easily. But there's another thing in number 9 is the reverse transcription and integration. And isn't it interesting that there are more viruses in a liter of coastal seawater than there are people on Earth? What is the importance of viruses? They are catalysts. Remember we talked about catalysts in the biogeochemical cycling. Viruses are catalysts. They do something. They do actually have a function. In fact, life cannot deal without viruses. And so when we put virus particles into perspective, so, we're talking about nanotechnology, which is 10 to the minus 9th. And so you look at the alpha helix of a protein, it's 1 nanometer. DNA is 2 nanometers. The ribosome is 20, the poliovirus is 30, and the Pandora virus is 1,000 nanometers. Size matters. And when we look at the history of the RNA, we see that it was first discussed in 1935, supposedly, and it progressed in 1953, where we had the structure of the DNA. And then in the 1960s, we had studies on the viral RNA replication. So all of this is all great for discussion. But what we want to look at when we look at the structure of protein, we want to see that it follows a rotating pattern. When we look at the DNA, we want to see that it follows a rotating pattern. We call it a helical coil. When that helical coil really tightens up as a protein, then you can create tissues. This is a very interesting structure. And this structure cannot be created without viruses. And so there's an RNA to DNA pass. So we all know that the RNA is a precursor to the DNA, and there's an interaction between the RNA and the DNA. But there's something called an mRNA, which is a feedback. And we need to have this feedback because we're living in an environment. So are you in the temperate zone? Are you in the Arctic zone? You know, are you in the tropical zone? So the environment will dictate how you feel. But one environment, say, is cold, and one environment is very hot. So you have to adapt to that. How do you adapt? So you have to have this feedback. So our DNA is fundamental to our cellular building. It's part of the amino acid progression. And so there has to be an adaptation. And so we said that with the cups of life, we had to adapt to the cup of the earth. And the adaptation of that is the cup of inertia. So literally what is happening is we're getting a feedback from the earth via the mRNA, and it's affecting our DNA. And it's perfectly normal. This is how you can go from a tropical climate to a cold climate. It's the rate of change that you're concerned with. So the protein is formed from the amino acid. The amino acids are the building blocks, and 3 are the foundation. But when you get the 4th one, that causes the folding over to make the protein. So when you make the protein, the byproduct is water. The question is what causes the folding? And the answer is that's the virus. So it's a folding facilitator. It's fundamental to the structural unit. And so you see how the different fields come together and they create. And so we understand from the bending where the negative part is the negative giver and the gravitational taker. And so for virology, they say, is an integrative science. And viruses are amazing. Yes, they are. They're also essential for life. And they're perfectly natural. The viruses that we have facilitate our bodybuilding. But as we said, there's a plasma reality and there's a physical reality. So the physical reality is a materialization. The plasma reality is a manifestation. And so we have to understand that if there's a plasma reality and a physical reality for our physicality, then the likewise is true for the RNA and the DNA. And one of the nice things, of course, that Gaston Mason was able to show was by changing the terrain, pH that is, of the medium, he was able to convert a virus into a bacteria and convert a bacteria into a virus. He did that by accident. And then he repeated that accident 40 times. So we see that, you know, energy comes in a pack. And so the pH is a gradient. And to transfer over that gradient, you have to do that as a charge, as an energy pack. And depending on the source of your energy determines the lifespan. And so if we're binding our energy and drawing that energy from the lowest energy form, then we shorten the lifespan. But if we're drawing it from the universal energy that is given to us wonderfully and feeds our RNA and DNA, so it allows us to transmute properly and manifest into our plasma reality, and then one step further into our physical reality. So the plasma reality is the GANS materials that we produce inside our skin. And the physical reality is what we produce with our skin and with our bodies and everything outside. This is all part of the transmutation process. And so we have to have this gravitational core, this cell, and this soul within the cell. And so each cell has a soul, and the governor is the soul of the body, and the connection is the soul of the man, and the materialization is the physicality. So we see the sequence from stable to unstable, or from unstable to stable, simple to complex. Let's do it that way. So from the amino acids through the DNA, which we just talked about previously, the fatty acids turns into protein, turns into cells, and then more complex cells. This is sequencing of the protein. So how come religiosity is in this subject? Because of the relationship between one scientific community, which has the conservation of the magnetic fields, versus the conservation of energy, and that relationship. But then we have the spiritual scientists, where the spirit is the motor of the soul. And we bring these together in a balancing relationship, which we call a maggrav. We understand a maggrav is a balance between magnetic and gravitational field forces. So this is where the plasma science adds to the knowledge by bringing these together. Well, this sounds like friction when you bring these two fields together. That friction is physical. When we look at the plasma friction, it's part of the creation. Remember the decay of the PM-TICs. And then when we bring the PM-TICs together to create a maggrav condition, and that eventually becomes a plasma and becomes a dynamic plasma and becomes manifest as part of our brain, which becomes also part of the rest of our body. And so we see this dynamic transfer state convert into this physical destination site. And that is the plasma soul feeding network. And it encompasses the universal cup. And we see the difference between the cup. The universal cup is more like the brain, and the stacker unit is more like the spine of the body and the interaction it has with the heart. the brain is smaller than the body. But the power of the brain is greater than the power of the body. And the soul of the man lives in the brain, and the soul of the body lives in the heart. So in terms of field strength, the soul of the man is the strongest, because the soul of the man is directly connected to the soul of the universe. So the universal cup is a representation of the embodiment of man. And when we draw that energy together and we hit a certain threshold, it manifests itself into a light. And if we can continue to increase the intensity of that light, then it'll radiate as does the sun. So we understand the process of how we go from nano to GANs through the popcorn process, the explosion of the nanoparticle into a giant energy ball. And from there, it can manifest into plasma light, which we can see. So we know the next step is as the sun. And so what happens is that energy has to go somewhere because it's always in motion. And so what you see is the manifestation of the plasma. And so that's the difference between small matter friction, which is the physical, and what you emit. That is the essential you. You give what you are. You give what you want. And when you give what you want, then that's what you get. So there are limits to uniqueness. Those limits to uniqueness are your inner limits. But they're not your outer limits as we look for outer space. So we have to understand some philosophical things to add to the physics things. And so we're very proud of our Bibles because it's one of the most read books in the world. But the most read book in the world is the Tao Te Ching. That is the #1 read book. I used to believe it was just the Bible because of all these stories. But there's a pattern to these stories. You know, there's Cain and Abel, there's Romulus and Remus, there's Enki and Enlil, there's the eagle and the snake, there's Confucius and there's Hippocrates. And a lot of this was outlined in the Lost Book of Enki, written by Zachariah Sitchin. And we like stories. But there's another story that comes out of Hawaii. And it's amazing, you know, this rock in the middle of the Pacific, miles from everywhere. And they have this basic teaching of the 3 selves. And at your leisure, you can read through this, but basically we're talking about the Upani, the conscious mind, the soul and the spirit. Then there's the unconscious mind, the Unihibili. And then there's the higher self, great kahuna. Three dimensions. So what is the relationship between 3 minds of mankind and how are they connected? So what they talk about is the Amakua. Which is the bringing together of the higher conscious mind of the Amakula. So we talked about bridges. That's where we started. We had one point, and then we're going to go to another point from here to there. So we need a terminology to be able to understand. Once we have this understanding, we can't read all the books in the library. How do we convert this understanding to knowing? How do we convert these details to knowledge? We have to depend on common connections. And we have to cross over the watershed and understand what is the difference between the windward side and the leeward side. How do we get over these mountain ranges? And so we see that we have to pack all these physical sciences, biology, botany, chemical science, and chemistry, and physics. These are all physical realities, and they're all on the leeward side. We have to cross over the watershed. We have to cross over the bridge to bridge the gaps. And we do this at higher orders of magnitude. So this is how we convert that knowledge into knowing. Because we can't all be chemists and physicists, but we all have to be contributors. So we have to understand the difference between plasma science and materialization science. We have to understand the difference between non-tangible and tangible. We have to recognize that on sight, on hearing, on awareness. We have to understand the difference between the source and the destination. We have to understand the difference between the body enhancement, which incorporates the soul, and the material enhancement, which materializes into the space that we're in. In this case, right now, it's Earth space, but it could be any space. And so that's the plasma science has the capability to do both. So we have to understand what is the difference. The materialization science is the physical science, and we have to move from there. And that's why you see these different modes of transport. We have PMTX, energy in motion, we have light, we have saucers, and we have spheres and cylinders. And we have the planet Earth, which goes round and round and round. And so we know that what goes around comes around. And we're always looking for it to it. Isn't that what we say? We have to get around to it. So part of the soul meditation is we have to provide the pattern, the star formation, so that we can get the energy, open up to the power of the universe, allow the energy to come in and yield to those forces so that you can receive. And the benevolent benefit that comes from that to facilitate the greater oneness, not to limit the greater uniqueness, but to facilitate and transcend the limitations of nuclear science, as we've done for 499 Thursdays in a row. And that transcends the physical science, the materialization science. This is the essential force that's behind the plasma science, the dynamic plasma, and we're all part of that science. And so on October the 2nd of 2021, we introduced the new space age, where we were moving from this materialization science. And so that's the purpose of these classes, is so that you understand the difference. This is the Keshe Foundation Space Institute teachings on plasma science, calling all knowledge seekers to see the connections. Life learning lessons transmute your soul growth. That's what life is all about. And we need to do that in peace. There's a World Peace Treaty, so sign it. Sign it with a pen, but sign it with meaning, with feeling, with emotion, and with your soul. It's this dilution of motion which allows the fields of life choices to be free from boundaries or abuse. And it's the ethos that maps your position. And the universal community is your travel guide because they're already following these rules and they would welcome you at the speed of love, which manifests and determines your inner space emotional constructs. The Earthbound Souls family, of which you're a part of, needs a physical and emotional gravitational transformation to not only enhance and heal, but to elevate. It's the emotion of knowledge that is embodied in transmutation connection. And this connects equally to the Universal Cosmic Rays Freedom Broadcast. This Freedom Broadcast channel broadcasts to your inner space. And so we have to understand that the proper materialization resonates with the proper plasma universe. The plasma science needs to continue to be delivered in exchange for peace on Earth. So welcome to the new outer space age. And that's the end of this trip. I hope you've all enjoyed it. And thank you for allowing me to present.
Very nice and detailed, quite long, but a lot packed in there, as you always do for us. Thank you, Alex. And as we always do, we ask if there are any questions or points someone would like to raise. And Alex, aren't we already in the mode of serving in so many ways? It's kind of a joke, but aren't we used to serving ourselves?
Yes. Well, yes, we are. We always do. We always have to. And this is the thing that when I got into sales, it was kind of last resort. You know, like you know, we all have these social stigmas and all these social judges, and you say, oh, you're going to be a salesman, you're going to be a car salesman. Well, the slang reason for that is because you're dishonest. But everybody's a salesman. You have to sell yourself to your wife. You have to sell yourself to your family. You have to sell yourself to your neighbors. You have to make a living. You need to sell your employer on your merit as an employee. You have to sell yourself to your coworkers as a contributing member. You may be an athlete. You have to sell the coach on, your ability to contribute to the team. And then you have to sell your team into believing that you're playing for the colors of the team that you represent and not a saboteur. And so this becomes a constant process. So yeah, we're all doing this all the time. And just, you change the name of what you're doing, but in fact, everything that you're doing is contributing in some way. So, when you look at the Three Little Pigs and, they built houses out of straw and houses out of wood, and they found that they would blow down or burn down, and they built the houses out of bricks, and they found them to be more stable. Well, this is what we have to do when we do building. As a bricklayer, are you laying bricks, or are you building a wall, or are you building a home? And is that home for you, or is that home for someone else? And if that home, the way you're building it, is for someone else, then the reward really is it helps you to be able to build again and continue and get better. And that's what life is all about. Life is for growing. So we seem to be the only species that, you know, the way we achieve is by sabotaging someone else and limiting their growth. Imagine if the plants did that. Well, they actually do in a way, but interestingly enough, if you, as a gardener, you would know that certain plants grow at certain times of the year, and so they will fade away. In the course of one season, in one area, you may have 3 residents. Well, that would be perfectly normal. This is like having tenants in a house. But what exactly are these plants doing? And so when each plant is a chemical factory, you find that that plant is drawing from the soil what it needs. But that plant was drawn to that position in the soil by what the earth needs. And so if the earth needed to have that particular element removed, and it called out to the plant, that plant grew there. When it fulfilled its function, it removed an element from the soil. But in that same process, it deposited another element, didn't it? Or it changed the nature of that soil. And so it was finished with its business. And so it leaves. But it doesn't walk away, does it? It decays. And what happens? Another plant comes in its place. And what happens now? The residue that the first plant left, the second plant discovers that is the nutrition it's been looking for. But how did it know that? Because there was a communication with the soul of the earth. The soul of the earth called that plant. They say, okay, you know, breakfast is over, it's lunchtime. And then that process continues, and another plant comes. And then what happens? Then the change of seasons. And if you're in a temperate climate, the summer turns to winter. And then you have the snow. And what happens next year? New plants grow. Oh, where did they come from? So these are the questions we have to ask. And as plasma scientists, when we look at it from the calling and answering, the magnetical gravitational force fields, the giving and the taking between the souls of the traveler, whether it be vertical or horizontal people, or the soul of the destination, the environment. It doesn't matter where it is, the rules are all the same. We have to understand the rules. And then we don't have to go around sabotaging things because the universe is a bountiful provider. But the universe is a provider in the plasma condition. The manifestation and materialization of that plasma condition is dependent on peace. Yeah, otherwise it doesn't happen. Everything else, what happens, becomes a compromise. And so you're drawing energy from the lower energy state. It's a balance between decay and creation, not an overcommitment to decay, 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 war, 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 poverty, poverty, poverty. It's not the way the universe is built. When the army passes through, after trampling on the flowers, and the army is gone, the flowers will come back. Which one's stronger? You don't need to be a rocket scientist to answer that question. All you need to do is open your eyes and have the eyes and the desire to see. Thanks for your question, Mike.
Right, I was just saying, it just feels so natural and comfortable in a way to serve yourself. Maybe
You have
because,
to. You have to.
right, but if you look at it from a enhanced level of understanding, then it becomes the service to others. But it is so comfortable and natural, and serving others it's not as comfortable and natural, probably because of all the ancestors and everything else. But this is the enlightened understanding when you find something to serve other than yourself.
The enlightened understanding. Amazing that you would say that. Yeah, you're so right.
Would anyone else have a question? I'd like to play, you find out the system is you, about 15 minutes of it, and then the final disclaimer. But let's see if anyone else has a question for you. I do have another question, but let's open the floor up to a question from anyone. An exception? A disagreement? An agreement?
I have a comment.
Go ahead.
The lady that came on before, is she still here?
Yes, I think she is. Yes, she is. About the dreams?
Yeah, about the
Anna?
dreams.
Yes.
So do you understand what a profound statement she made? Do you understand how deep she has grasped the whole concept?
Yes, with journals and everything.
Yes, but you know, it was a residue. The journals were a residue, and the dreams were a residue. They were not the science behind it, and she's clearly seen that. So I want to comment on that. That was so profound, such an important discovery. And you know what it does is it shows that. Would you say, well, which comes first, the chicken or the egg? Well, which comes first, the application of the science or the understanding of the science? And so in her case, she was applying the science, and she had so much confidence and trust in it. And you know, this is what the whole purpose of the plasma science is to explain the science behind, shall we say, that phenomenon. And so, you know, she has not only elevated her soul in that process, and that what was her name? Anna?
Yes.
Yeah. So Anna has gained an understanding that is orders of magnitude, you know, higher. It's like it's in a flash, you know, it's like reading 10 books in one sitting, you know, and all of a sudden, oh, you know, now I get it. And you know, and I just want to compliment you not only on the fact that you know you've achieved this, but also the way you presented it. It is you will be no doubt very skillful teacher, and I'm sure many people will benefit from your knowledge. And I want to thank you.
Okay, others? Anyone else want to raise a point? Ask a question, feel free. Josepha in the chat. Viruses are modifiers of matter at the field level, would be tools for modifying the peaceful environment by changing the matter plasma of entities, if I understand correctly. And then there's a second question. Viruses are modifiers of matter at the field level, would be tools for modifying the peaceful environment by changing the matter plasma of entities, if I understand correctly. Well, they do contribute to our changes. We think of viruses often as very negative things, but this is how we sort of grew or changed and through the viruses. It's modified us to the point of growing, I think, and changing in so many ways. And this has created this evolution. I think the viruses help to contribute that. And I think we'll have a lot more experience with viruses in the future for those who go into space. Alex, would you want to add anything?
There has to be a selection. So what constitutes goodness and badness? And it doesn't just apply to virus, it applies to anything. You know, so let's say if you have a peaceful household and you have a rabble rouser coming in, someone sabotaging all your work. So you see the chaos that ensues. So these viruses are energy packs, and so we see from the cups of life that we can either enhance the virus, you know, to facilitate its work, or we deplete the energy of the virus, because the virus by definition is an energy pack. And they
helped us mutate.
No, well, see, the mutate has a connotation to it, right? It helps us manifest, it helps us create. So you could say the mutation is a form of creation, okay? It's just like destruction is another form of creation. But there's an intimate relationship between the virus and the protein. So when we're looking at a transition state, and if we look at the progress, you know, from the amino acid, and let's do that. Let me just see if I can. Let me just see if I can find this. Where was that? I think you know what I'm talking about.
The whiteboard?
No, I wanted to. Sorry, just give me a second here. I'm not working with it. What am I doing? I can't find it.
Okay. You mean one of the panels?
Yeah, I'm looking for that. There we are. I found it. So when we look at the progressive protein, you see that?
Yes.
Well, how does the amino acid become DNA? And then how does the DNA become a fatty acid? How does the fatty acid become a protein? So, you know, these are energy levels. There are transition levels in between. So the virus is, if you will, facilitates a transition level. The virus is an energy pack. When you transit from one energy level to another energy, you are either contributing or you're depleting yourself. You're contributing to another energy level or you're depleting yourself. Let me put it another way. Very crude. You're going to the grocery store, right? So your physicality has to be moved to the grocery store. So wherever your physicality is right now, let's say you're at home, you have to deplete that presence and move that presence to the grocery store. So you'll be enhancing your presence at the grocery store and depleting your presence at the home. And the car, if you will, that you're going to drive from the home to the grocery store is the facilitator. And so the thing is that, you know, you park the car, you go into the car, you move the car, you park the car, you get out of the car. So the net result, your presence in the grocery store versus your presence in the house is what you see. You don't see the car, right? So the car and the virus kind of have the same function. They're a facilitator. And, you know, when I was looking at the Columbia University teachings, and they describe how the energy transferred from an amino acid to the DNA, there was no facilitator. There was a virus, it had a presence, but there was no facilitator. So that means that the virus that they were talking about was in a physical form. Because Gaston-Nasons was able, by changing the pH, move a virus into a bacteria, which the bacteria, I think, was 10 times larger. So an order of mass, or order of magnitude larger. And he did that by altering the pH. So when we look at the medical community, they have these two fields of interest. One is bacteriology and one is virology. And these are two separate fields, but they fall under the umbrella of the medical field. So Gaston-Nasons was able to transcend that by altering the pH, and then so he's done that. And so according to their teachings, as they've shown on YouTube, it's fundamental to the creation of protein. But the protein is physical. How can the protein be created? Well, it has to fold over. It has to fold over. Where does it get the energy to fold over? What's the difference between amino acids linking in a chain or amino acids folding over into a protein? Okay, because you're adding another amino acid, but there's a difference. One's in a chain and one folds over. What's the difference? What causes that difference? Something causes it. And so whatever it is, it has to be something.
Okay. Before we go to Joseph's second question, I think I have an easy question. The first stacker, the top cup we call the cup of soul. The second cup down we call the soul
cup of emotion.
Soul of physicality. The third cup down, this is where the question is, we called it the physicality. Now,
yes.
Would you agree that we could call that cup the physicality or the physical soul? Are those interchangeable?
No, they're different energy levels.
Okay.
No, the physicality is not in the cup of physicality. The physicality is in the cup of inertia.
The third cup down is the cup of physicality, or the physicality. And I'm saying, can you call that the physical soul? You know how we
Yes,
have the
yes.
soul of the man, the soul of physicality, and we have the physicality. Could we say a physical soul would be the same term as is the third cup down, the physical soul, is that term interchangeable with physicality?
No, those are two separate questions. So the cup of physicality and
The
the soul
third
of
one down we're talking about.
No, I know, but the physicality itself is a manifestation, has to take in its consideration the environment.
Yeah,
You
I think
can't.
they all do in a way.
Yes, they all do in a way, but there is a cup of inertia.
Right.
So that inertia is the manifestation of the physicality.
Right, but the
Be-
question is physical soul and physicality on that third cup, are they interchangeable? Could you say the physical soul? Or you could say the physicality. Just a question.
No, the soul of physicality and the physicality are two separate things.
Right, but I'm saying on the physicality, could you call that the physical soul?
Yes, you could
Okay.
call it a physical soul.
Or you could call it physicality.
No, physicality is physicality. The
Everything has
physical,
a soul, we know that, correct?
yeah, but what is the physicality made from? The physicality is an amalgamation of more complexity of the cells.
That's the soul of physicality. That's the second cup down from the top. We're talking the third cup down, the physicality. Okay, we can pass on this. Let's go to Joseph's.
No,
It's okay.
if I may, please. This is a very important point. Okay, because the emotion and the physicality are literally on the same level with the soul, because the soul communicates with the emotion and the soul communicates with the physicality, and it uses the emotion to facilitate that.
Right, there's three types of emotions: the soul interacting with the soul of physicality, the physicality interacting with the soul, and the physicality interacting with the soul of physicality. Those are the three emotions.
You got it. You got it. That is, so use that as a foundation for your answer. Okay, so in the second position would be this emotion. So in the third position would be the soul of the body. The physicality has to take into consideration the environment. What we're saying is that the soul of the man and the soul of the body work together as a team, and they're connected. And they're eternal. Where are they is determined by the environment. Once you take into account the environment, then you can determine the reality. And that reality always is plasmatic, but it could also be physical. There's no rule that says that the plasmatic reality has to materialize into the physical reality. This is a key point, because the universal community is operating on the plasmatic level. And the reason for that is because they're at a higher energy level. And so their exchange of energy, the rate of change, is also at a higher level, right? So what for you and me might take 10 years, for them might take 10 minutes. But, you know, we're talking about Earth rotations around the sun when we're talking about time. You know, what time are they following? Okay, what are they rotating around, you know? So our reference point, because we're talking in the terms of physicality, is Earth rotations around the sun. That's how we measure time. Now, this brings up a very, very important point, and that is, if we are continually focusing on this physicality, and that's what today's discussion from my part was all about. If we are focusing on the physicality and we forget that it is a construct of the plasmatic reality, we have taken selectively the benefit and the feature of being able to manifest into the physicality. And why I'm drawing that conclusion is because I believe now that that is a very, I won't say exclusive, but it is a very enhanced, unique characteristic that not all the universal community members can do. And in a way, having said that, I see it as a reward, if you will. You know, if you work hard and you know you will prosper. Let's say that's kind of the modus operandi. Okay, well, by coming into the physicality, this is a desirable feature. Many of us see coming into the physicality as being hell. And I think that's right there is the problem. We need to see that coming into physicality is coming into heaven. The fact that we have some who are...
They're lined up to get in, Alex.
They are lined up to get in.
You know.
They are lined that they're so desperate to come in that they will actually manifest themselves into an undesirable situation. You know, that they'll be born in the middle of a war zone, right? That's how, you know, desirable it is. And if we understand that that is so desirable, then we need to respect that. And for us to be depressed about it, something that is, you know, so cherished and so desirable, but you know, what is the problem? And so the problem is that in order to manifest this physicality, we have to adopt a plasmatic binding. But we can't live by plasmatic binding. We have to have a binding and a flowing. Okay? The binding is a binding that comes from two plasmatic fields. And that gives you your 3 dimensions. And we are none of those 3 dimensions. We are in the other dimension that chooses to go which 3 dimensions you want to go into. And one of those 3 dimensions has to take into consideration the environment. And not only, there's no limitation to that. There's a soul family of all the members on the planet. There's a soul of the planet itself. There's a soul of all the planets in the solar system. And let's face it, you know, if you're going that route, you have to understand it's the soul of the sun as well. Because the soul of the sun is this catalytic, benevolent provider that provides unconditionally. And whether the sun is shining or whether the sun is on the other side of the planet is fed unconditionally. And that is the key. And then how come, you have to ask yourself, how come we age, but the sun is able to provide this, shall we call it, glory every day, unconditionally every day, because it has to be supplemented. And it can only be supplemented if it's giving. So there's a giving first, there's a taking then, and the balance of that creates that mag-grav condition. So it's a mag-grav plus the residue, okay? And so if it's giving, it's plus magnetical. If it's taking, it's plus gravitational. But it has to have a construct. It has to have that field. And that field maintains its binding position. But that binding position from that field gives the emission and the absorption spectrum. And it's that emission and absorption spectrum which locks into another common denominator. Okay, so in order to say that something is good or something is bad, you have to compare it to the lock that you have. And we all have a lock. We have to have a lock, because otherwise, you know, if oil and water mixed, we'd be bags of mush. I said that. So this division between oil and water is a good thing. But if we keep that in the near balanced position, then we have a healthy life in heaven on earth. But if we get into a highly acidic, toxic condition, then we have poor health. And if we get into a high alkaline position, then we have an emulsification where we have the oil and water blending. So, you know, these are the facts. And if we can do that in the physicality, in the physical reality, which is a construct, it's a residue of the plasmatic reality, then the method by which that physical reality is materialized is the same method that the plasma reality is manifested. And this is what we have to understand. We just have to understand which direction it's coming from. So it's our point of view. And our point of view has to understand that the universe is a peaceful place. That's how the universe works. That's how the universe exists and will continue to exist. And that's the purpose of life. So, you know, all we have to do is just assume our responsibility and understand that we can create what we emit. And so what we emit becomes very important, because what we emit is what we want, but we have to be truthful. And our physicality is not very skillful in being truthful. So we have to rely faithfully on a mission from our soul, because our soul will never lie. Our soul will never kill. Our soul is what makes the flowers grow when the armies leave. Today's class, Mark, I want to thank you, Lonnie, for presenting this, and understand that this is a review. So, you know, it's a review of 6 classes. So, you know, as long as this one is, it's a condensation of probably easily 9 hours of teaching. So thank you all for allowing me to present. Thank you for your question.
Okay, not so fast. We want to get to Joseph's second question.
Okay.
And then we're going to stay another 15 minutes. I put that in the chat earlier about you find out the system is you. Second question from Joseph. By decreasing the physical food, we disengage from the strength of the physical amino acid. So these modifications do not allow conditioning. Is the field in the gap, the space gap? That's where the correction takes place, I believe, in that space gap. But I'll read it again. By decreasing the physical food, we disengage from the strength of the physical amino acid. So these modifications do not allow conditioning. That is connected to the first question on the viruses. I think.
The virus that comes from the universe and facilitates our birth is essential for our life. And the purpose of the feedback is to be able to adapt properly to the environment. And so those viruses that we are born with are the viruses that facilitate that. But the universe is full of viruses. And so the reason we even got into the subject way before, I mean, like 20 years ago, was because that is a hazard when you go into space. And if you don't solve that problem, you can't even get into outer space. So understand that space and outer space are not the same place. So outer space requires you to travel at this elevated speed, which then exposes you to all of these other viruses. So how do you differentiate? So you have this shielding, you have this plasmatic shielding that helps you select that, right? But there's always a possibility that you engage with that. So there has to be a antidote, if you will. And so what the plasma does is it facilitates the way you deal with it by either contributing energy to it, so making something else, or by depleting energy from it, shall we say, digesting it. Okay, like a lysosome would digest a dead cell, right? So is a dead cell a toxicity, or is a dead cell then becomes converted into nutrition? So that is the functionality of it. The thing is that we are always going through this process, and as plasma being, we are highly skillful in doing that, and because we're operating at a higher energy level, it's not that much of a problem. If we engage in the unique characteristic of being able to transmute our physicality, we have now an extra burden. Okay, we have an extra responsibility. And this transmutation process isn't, shall we say, on the same level. It's not. It's not at the same level as the soul and the soul of the body. So by being at a lower energy level, it becomes more susceptible to these other forces. Okay, so that's why it becomes such an essential part of the space travel. If we didn't travel that way, it's possible we wouldn't have to worry about it. I mean, obviously we were born, right? We were obviously born into this physicality, and so we navigated through outer space, and we were able to be, shall we say, immune to all of these forces, and we came in whole. And then we had to adapt to the environment, and the success of our adaptation is measured in our physicality and how we interact with that physicality. Okay, And so then we also have to adapt to that. So then there are the forces that we have here on this planet. Generally speaking, this planet is conducive to the forces that we were created with. That's why we came to this planet. So when we go into traveling into outer space, we want to make that decision again. We don't want to make the wrong decision and go to a planet that is not friendly. When they say planet, I don't want to go to a destination that is not friendly to our well-being. And so when you look at a kidney cell, can you imagine what kind of chaos would a kidney cell have if it went into a pancreas? You know, I mean, would a bar fight break out? You know, I mean, that's you know, kind of the thing. So no, it wouldn't, because first of all, that's not going to
Taxi
happen.
destination. It wouldn't.
Yeah,
It only fits in one place.
there you go. So this becomes a very important question, and very important to understand the answer to this question. And all of it revolves around the gift that we have of what we call physicality. And that's just why not only should we treasure that, but you know, we need to understand it better, because what has happened has affected not only this planet, but it's affected you know, our neighbors around here. And we are in the game, shall we say, whether we want to or not. But the truth is, we do want to. We have to understand that truth, because we're making a decision based on the physical environment. What we have to do is make that decision on our soul. Our soul has already made the decision. And how do you know that? Because you're here already. That's the answer. And, you know, a lot of people ask, you know, well, when did you make that decision? Well, at the same time you were asked that question, you know, are you ready to come into the physicality? You know, oh yeah, I'm ready. Sure you are, you know. Well, here you go. And when you go into the physicality, and you know, we can see that a lot aren't ready. But the thing is, we come in the memory loss, the amnesia, right? Where is that memory? That memory is locked up in our soul, that emotion of knowledge that we carry. And when we transfer that emotion and we confuse it with physicality, we say, oh, no. This emotion thing, that's a woman thing. That's a, you know, woman's problem. You know, that's not a man's problem. Men are physical, you know, women are so emotional. And it's said in a derogatory tone. Whereas you look at the field strength of the emotion, it's of a higher strength than the physicality. Well, what are you doing when you say that? You're saying, oh, I am disassociating myself from the strongest, and I am pretending to be the strongest. Oh, you know, you're a wise man.
We're used to that.
Well, that's why we're in the condition that we're in. So, but anyway, it's more than just a great conversation. It's very important to understand. And as you've clearly pointed out, you know, we have to have a sense of humor around that, and understand with common things, because not all of us are, you know, plasma scientists. But what we have to understand is the consistency that we have, and measure it that way. And we'll see that as we understand that there are other factors that come into play, then we become more skillful, and then we can take more other factors come into play. And frankly, I'm just going to end on this, is that this thing, what we're doing in August with respect to, you know, the enhancement of the soul and the combination with the physicality, you know, when you start looking and making judgments on the decisions that you've made in the past, and we can all be very harsh critics, And we realize, oh my God, what a mistake we made. And then you realize, well, you did the best that you could with what you knew. But were you truthful in that? Or were you selective in that? You know, did you only have selective hearing? Did you only hear what you wanted to hear and you didn't want to hear what you didn't want? And so you find that you become your own storyteller, and you lie to yourself and you deceive yourself. And that is really a very bad way to go. And we all do this. So now we come to the judgment day. And this is, no one else can judge you. You have to judge yourself. We have to understand that if the parents leave and the kids are left behind, the house is not going to burn down. Okay, the kids will be responsible. If you're not there to supervise, they will only behave when you're there to supervise them, then it's not working. Okay, the measurement is how will you behave when you don't need the supervision, and when you look through how you've navigated through life. You say, oh, I got in with a gang of thieves, so I became a crook. What, you didn't have an option? You did have an option, and that becomes another subject. So we now have choices, and those choices are on the table. We're in the post-June 6th, 2022 era, and we have the choices to understand we are in heaven. We don't have to look for heaven. We are in heaven. And we have to think that way. Okay, back to you, my friend.
Okay, I did have a question on ions, but perhaps we'll shelve that for now.
I just wanted to ask a
Go ahead.
question. It's
Hi
about
there.
the hello. I just got chopped off on the electricity, so I missed the best part of what you were talking. I just wanted to ask you, you mentioned the emotion is a higher energy level, and I mean that's between the spark and your spirit, sorry, spirit and soul of man. So that's kind of like the connection between the two, and that's why you're saying it's more energy. It's above your physicality and so on. Right. Okay. And then what about our detachment? Because I'm trying very hard to understand this. If you have emotions, which if we don't have them, I think we're kind of dead. But if we have our emotions, we have to be detached. Is it like you sort of stand and watch everything that you're doing? It's a little bit hard to think about.
If you get attached to the physicality, you're getting attached to the product of what you've created. So if you've created that, then you can create anything. So you don't need to be attached to that.
So once you think about it, you've done it, and then you have to go and change it to something else.
Well, if you want to.
Okay.
If you want to, you say, well, this is my house. Okay. Well, okay, so that's your house. So what does that mean? That means everything else is not your house. Well, how stupid is that? When you're a member of the universe, how can you disown the universe? It's really what you've done, isn't it?
Yeah, I guess. Yeah, because we're a part of it.
Yeah. So the moment you say, well, this is me, okay, well, you immediately, bam, stamped a limitation on yourself. Because in order to identify who you are, you have to identify who you're not. And who you are is actually the product of who you are. In the physicality, you're the product of who you are. Who you are created your physicality. Okay? So don't be attached to your creation. Be attached to the creator.
So, okay.
Does that make sense? Are you okay?
Well, we'll see how it works out. I'm just asking about the emotions because sometimes we get stuck and you've got a very bad habit, so
Yeah,
it's hard
yeah,
yeah.
yeah. You've got to let it go. I mean, you know, you've got to understand that it's like they say, you get knocked down. It isn't getting knocked down that's the problem. It's how you get up after you get knocked down. That's the that's the problem. Some people don't want to get up after that. But
Mm.
how did you get there in the first place? You're beautiful because you're beautiful, not because of the makeup that you put on or any lipstick. Okay, so so wherever you are, you're still beautiful. That's the whole point. So to say, well, the reason I'm ugly is because my environment is ugly. Well, you created that environment, so no wonder you look that way. you know, so by attaching yourself to that, you abdicate your responsibility. That's what I'm saying. So by detaching yourself from that, you have the responsibility. Okay, and so you're here because you want to be here. You're there because you want to be there. But then someone imposes their will and says, "Well, no, you can't go there. We're not going to allow that." Well, it's like, when did this happen? How come you're in charge? And that's what we have. We have people who are, dictating terms. And the moment you dictate those terms, then you're deciding on behalf of the universe. Wow, that's that's pretty big.
Dale, I just made you co-host again. I'm going to repost everything except what you posted about Star Trek. So if you want to copy any of it, fine. Very
Okay,
good.
thank you very much.
Anna has her hand up. You don't need a hand, Anna. You just need to open your mic.
Yes, thank you, and thank you all of you for wonderful teachings that I am privileged to have. So we are the creators of our physicality. Only a question. We are the creators of our emotions. I interfere that creating our physicality, we are the creators of our physicality, our emotions. My question is, if we are not longer satisfied, or if whatever we created not longer serves us, how to activate the creator that we are to manifest other things? I know there is no recipes for things, but I'd like you to comment on that, please.
Well, that is the challenge. It's exactly what we were talking about with Gail there. You have to detach yourself, from that. Let's look at a situation where someone is abused as a child. Does that give them a right as an adult to go abuse their children? Is that something that can be passed on from generation to generation? No, you don't have that right to do that. Okay, so what happened in the past will not disqualify you from anything that happened in the future, but it won't qualify you also. Okay, so what that means is that nothing anyone says or does can affect you unless you allow it. So if you were abused in the past and you want to carry that baggage forward, then that's your problem. So you can drop that baggage anytime you want, and put yourself in a happy place, and guess what? You'll be happy. Go to a party, and almost you can do a poll there, and you could say, well, who's the happiest person? Oh, it's that girl that's dancing over there with the big smile. She's the happiest person. She's the light of the party. Well, what about the rest? Oh, I don't want to be with them. I just want to be with her. Why? Because happy people like being with happy people. They say misery loves company. Sure, if you're striving to go to the bottom of the barrel, but you know, we all have the capability of being happy. And that happiness comes from making other people happy. You know, who doesn't want to be around happy people? And if you're around miserable people and you give, and all they do is take, and you say, hey, wait a second, I'm not going to give anymore. That's it, I'm done, I'm out of here. And that's what we do. We go to our own place of refuge. We call it a refugium. And that's why there's no conflict in outer space. You want a conflict? Guess what? Conflict yourself by yourself. Okay, we're out of here. And so if we go into outer space as warmongers, we're going to be lonely because nobody's going to want to talk to us, and they can very easily leave. There's no problem. They're gone. Okay, and they'll just go somewhere else. And wherever else they go, they're going to be happy. And wherever you are, you're going to be miserable. And that's why misery loves company, because it's very lonely when you're miserable like that. So you have to make that decision. And remember the rule. You have to allow these things to happen. So don't allow it to happen. You have to take that responsibility. How do we do there? Anna, can you find your mic?
Yes, I'm just taking notes as he goes on. Because I think it's a very simple rule of interacting with ourselves and who we are as a creator. And at the same time, it's a powerful tool to stop all these that is going on, and having the power and really exercise our own power.
Yes,
And,
yes.
there is a lot of beauty and simplicity in it. So thank you very much.
My pleasure, and I thank you very much again, because you caught on to it. That's one of the things, you know, when you're looking at all the people on this panel here. Many of us have been together for a very long time, and then we're going through this review process. And it's a welcome thing I'm finding. It's a welcome for me as well, because, you know, learning doesn't stop. So, you know, it's nice to see what has happened in the last few years, you know, and how things have changed. And as Mr. Kesha said, you know, you can review the classes going back, you know, over a decade, and you'll find that you always learn something new. And that's what learning is. That's what life is all about. It's a school for learning. Life is for learning. So thank you very much.
And Stephanie says, thank you, Alex, Mark, Kesh family. And it looks like 3 red poppies.
Nice.
Any other comments? Like I said, we put this, you are the system, you'll find out the system is you. So I'm going to play about 15 minutes of it, and then the final disclaimer. Feel free, you don't have to stay. But I'm going to play this for those people who may see this at a future time, a future date, no problem.
Beautiful. Thank you all.
Thank you all, Alex, Mark, and all present KS knowledge seekers.